just what does an average work day look like for you?
Well, as you know, my average workday is much like today, fighting your way through traffic, um, literally making phone calls while I'm on my way, trying to find a story for the day, talking to contacts and sources every day. That process generally starts at home before I actually even officially start working here, because if you wait until you get to the station to start making calls, people's days are starting to progress. It can be harder to get a hold of people. And uh, so that's how I start my day, is making calls, trying to find out maybe what the story of the day for me will be. And then, of course, I'll have one idea about that. Uh, my editors and managers might have a different idea, something else that they want covered. But I've been doing this now. I've been at Channel 5 for, it'll be 31 years in September. They pretty much trust my judgment on what I think is the story of the day. And so, but we'll have a meeting and we'll discuss all the reporters' pitches. And then once the stories are green lighted, so to speak, then we all go out and start conducting our interviews, doing our research, and then we come back to the station, or we're out in the field and we'll work on our laptops. We write our stories, and then with any luck, we're on the air in time by 4:35 or 6, or all of those newscasts.
You seem to do a really great job of taking some pretty dense information when it comes to, the political world and making that easy for people to access, the general public. What sort of advice would you have for a student journalist wanting to go into political journalism in that realm?
3 words: keep it simple. You're going to cover, I will cover a legislative hearing or a debate on the House or Senate floor that might stretch on for hours. I mean, literally hours. And then I'm going to have 2 minutes roughly to boil that all down at night for our newscasts. So the key is find generally the 2 or 3 central themes of, let's say it's a bill about gun control. What are the 2 or 3 main takeaways from the debate that you just sat through, and the things that are the most important to the success or failure of the bill, and also to the success or failure if the bill becomes law, what is most likely to have an impact on people, especially the people watching, our viewers. I always keep the viewer in mind. What are they going to want to know out of this? They don't generally want to know all of the political infighting that goes on, and there's a lot of pettiness that happens in politics, just like in business or anything else. You've got to separate all of that and just stick to what is the most important. So my best advice to any journalism student is to keep it simple. Just boil it down, and don't feel like, oh my gosh, I sat through a 5-hour hearing. I've got to cover everything that was covered in those 5 hours. That is simply not true.
What would you do, or what do you do in the case of a challenging interview when you're not quite possibly getting the information that you need from someone?
Yeah, and that can be tough, because sometimes you don't know if they're hiding something, or if they just simply don't know or are not as knowledgeable as maybe they should be, and they don't want to say that. So it's just, every situation is a little bit different, and you have to get as much information as you can. There's only so much you can get if somebody's either being uncooperative or doesn't know the answer to your question. So you just have to do the best you can and then move on. And generally, we have more than one interview in a story. So maybe you'll get more information, or the information you need, from the next interview.
Okay. Can you just tell me a little bit about what your most memorable interview was?
Wow, there's been a lot of them, but I would have to say 2 of them stick out. I was the only television reporter in the Twin Cities granted interviews with President Trump. And I had two interviews with him, and one at a business roundtable down in Burnsville, and then one when he was running for reelection, and it was at the Mankato airport. And the reason that was so memorable was it was the middle of COVID. It was August of 2020. So we're in, the heat of the COVID battle. And just to get the interview, just to be granted access to him, we had to show up extra early at the airport that morning, far long before he even landed, go through special COVID testing with the Secret Service. And then they were doing the rapid test. So then me and my photographer had to, go off to the side and wait 30 minutes. And if we tested positive for COVID, we would be sent immediately home and not get the interview. And that would go for both of us, because if one tested negative and one was positive, they'd assume, well, the other one might be positive too and just isn't testing yet because we've been together. So that was a little nerve-wracking even before the interview. Are you going to test negative or positive so you can even get access to him? Luckily, we both tested negative. And then the president did his speech, his campaign speech, in front of an audience on the tarmac out at the Mankato airport. And we were in a special, what they called the president's bubble, the people who had these blue wristbands that meant we had been tested that day and were considered negative for COVID. And we couldn't mix with anyone else. If we came in contact with anybody else that it was not in this bubble, then we would be again asked to leave. So there was a lot of stress even just leading up to the interview. And then finally, when he was done, we were summoned to go do this exclusive interview with him right next to Air Force One, right out on the runway. And so I would say that was probably the most memorable. And I've interviewed other presidents, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, but just because of the circumstances of this one, I would say it was memorable. And I will say one thing about President Trump, for as bombastic as he usually was, especially about the media, when you meet him one-on-one, he was incredibly gracious and answered any question I had, no matter how controversial it might be, and didn't shy away from anything. And so clearly those were very memorable, because let's face it, right now, love him or loathe him, he is the most memorable character in American politics, not just now, but maybe in the past 100 years.
Mhm. Okay, good. Awesome. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I just had one last. Are there any other pieces of advice, last minute advice you would give to students?
Yeah, if you're going to do journalism, whether it's print journalism, which is now largely web journalism, because there's so few. I'm one of the few relics who still gets the paper in my driveway every day, just because I love having a book. I love having a newspaper in my hands. But whether you're studying print journalism or going into television, or yes, radio still exists for students out there who don't think that it does. If you're going into any of those things, it's a very rewarding profession. It's funny, unrelated to this conversation we're having, one of my coworkers and I were just talking yesterday about how we remember how excited we were when we got our first jobs in journalism, and in our case in television, and then our next job, which is also usually in a smaller market, and how excited you were to just go anywhere. And it didn't even have to be an exciting place. My first job was in Austin, Albert Lea, Minnesota, which I loved. I went down there for 2.5 years, and I learned so much living in these smaller towns. And never lose your curiosity. When you go to these places, don't lose your enthusiasm. Don't lose your curiosity. Just understand, in journalism, you're generally going to start in a smaller market, and you're going to build your way up to a place like Minneapolis. This was always my goal, because it's my hometown. I always wanted to come back to Minneapolis. And I went from Austin, Albert Lea to Fort Myers, Naples for 2.5 years. Then I went to Des Moines, Iowa, worked for an NBC affiliate, So I worked at other stations around the country for 9 years before I got my dream job, for me anyway, back here in the Twin Cities. And I never lost my enthusiasm for the job, even now. And in December, it will be 40 years since I started my first job in television news down in Austin, Minnesota, December 28th of 1983. And I'm still as excited to come in and wonder what the day is going to hold, just as I was back then. Because the great thing about journalism, it changes every day. The news changes every day, and you don't know what's coming next. And that's one of the things I find truly exciting about this. Not to denigrate salespeople, but if you're selling widgets or insurance, there's a lot of sameness every single day. Nothing wrong with that. It can be a nice living. I like having something different every day, and that's what journalism is all about.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on the 40 years coming up. That's that's an awesome honor to have.
And I know what you're thinking. Boy, I must have been 10 when I started. No,
No.
but it's no, I've loved it every day, and obviously, there still might be time for me to quit this profession and go try something new for a couple of years before I officially retire. But that day isn't here yet. I still enjoy doing what I'm doing.
That's awesome. Sounds like you found the right fit and the right career. Uh,
I think so.
to enjoy it
I
that
do.
much. So that's
And,
rewarding.
and I wish luck to all of your students. Anybody thinking about going into this, um, look into it. And if you decide, even as a young person, this is really what you want to do, go for it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and have a wonderful day. And I really appreciate your willingness to have this conversation this morning. It's really valuable for students to see professionals out there in the field kind of doing the work that they want to do. So
Well, absolutely. And I like to um, let young people know what this profession is all about. And I like them to see you can still be enthusiastic about it even after 4 decades.